So the next speaker is Stein. He's taking Peter Kwong's place today. And you all are welcome to stand at the podium, or you can sit. It's fine, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. So Sam is a tenant organizer in New York and works with tenants and neighbors to reform the state-level rent laws and build tenant power. He's a graduate of Hunter College's Masters in Urban Planning program and is currently writing a co-authored book with Peter Kwong on gentrification in Chinatown. So Sam is going to kind of bridge what's happening in Chinatown to China.
I'm going to try. I don't know how much I can do, but thank you. And I should just make it clear that I'm only speaking as myself and not a representative of tenants and neighbors or any other group that I work with. But I thought I would speak a bit about some of the research that I've been doing with Peter Kwong about gentrification in Chinatown. Chinatown is a pretty different case study for gentrification than a lot of other places that have experienced it in New York and elsewhere. For one thing, because of its proximity to Wall Street, for one, and also just because of where the economy is right now, it's a gentrification that's driven by global finance capital, in which the neighborhood is more completely destroyed than inhabited and transformed. The more classical model for gentrification is there's a lot of vacancy, there's a lot of, stores are out, and then artists, particularly younger white mobile artists, will move in, will do work on the apartment, the property values go up, they sell, there's a rent gap, they can rent for more. That's the classic model for gentrification. But in Chinatown, it's not really declining. Things are hard in Chinatown, no doubt, but it's showing signs of recovery from both the traumas of the decline of the garment manufacturing industry and from 9/11. It's fully occupied and it's expanding, or at least it has been in recent years. It's not full of vacant property except where landlords are warehousing on purpose. And there's still a lot of jobs in a lot of different industries. And in a lot of ways, Chinatown has figured out ways to get around the traumas of 9/11 and of the garment industry declining. And a case study of that is the restaurant industry, which everyone knows there's a lot of restaurants in Chinatown, but it's really a lot more than that. There's Chinese-owned farms in New Jersey and Florida that are growing the produce for the restaurants. There's managing imports from China that happens in Chinatown. There's sign and menu design and production, kitchen supply wholesaling. There's these job placement centers that are sending people all over the country to work, which of course creates problems in terms of tenancy. There's buses, which not only are cheap chances for students to go to Boston, but they're also moving people from Chinatown to far-flung jobs all over the country. And of course, there's the New York City restaurants. There's chefs, delivery workers, cleaners. All of this existed already in Chinatown, but it's gone from a neighborhood that was serving itself to a neighborhood that's basically the economic hub for Chinese industry all over America. So this, if you think of the classical way of how gentrification happens, it wouldn't be in Chinatown, but it certainly is. Because of the housing pressures, because of its location in Manhattan, it's the only working class people of color neighborhood left in lower Manhattan, especially if you include parts of the Lower East Side. So there's a real need to fight gentrification in Chinatown for all the reasons that we fight gentrification everywhere, but also because Chinatown has built all this economic activity. It's not stagnant, it's not declining, and so the recent economic growth is like a return on investments made by immigrant workers and often family business owners that are now being pushed out just as their economic strength is returning after 9/11, after the garment industry. So what are the signs of gentrification in Chinatown today? Rising cost of housing, new luxury construction, small business displacement. There's some hipster or yuppie bars and restaurants around. There's also a lot of Chinese banks and investment capital, more than there's ever been before. And if you look at the work of Tari Hum on what these banks are doing, they're not financing small family-owned businesses. They're not financing opportunities to rehab affordable housing. They're going to large development projects, both in Chinatown in Manhattan and also in Flushing and in Sunset Park, and even in Harlem and communities that don't have large Asian populations. And I think that I'll get to this a little bit later, but that is one way to connect what's going on in Chinatown to what's happening in China. And as of now, it's not happening in a strictly planned way. The rezonings around Chinatown have mostly ignored Chinatown, which also I'll get to later. It's just what the current market conditions and the location of Chinatown, I think, are producing. And I want to think about gentrification in Chinatown as something that the market is doing, but is being enabled by the state. And often we think of gentrification as a market process, and it certainly is that, but it's not a process that can happen without the state power to enable it. And then I don't have quite as much to say about this, but the reverse is really true in China also. The discourse about China is often the state is doing this. The state is all-powerful. The state displaces land grabs. All true, but the state is also enabling and enabled by the market in China and by commercial industry there. So the case I want to build about the state enabling gentrification in Chinatown is a historical one. It can go back a long way. I'm going to choose to go back to Robert Moses and the Lower Manhattan Expressway. That plan began in 1929, was approved in 1941, and it would have sent a 250-foot wide highway through Chinatown, the Lower East Side, and what's now Soho and Tribeca. 120,000 vehicles across Manhattan every day. It would have covered Watt and Broome streets with on and off ramps at Canal. So basically there would have been no Chinatown. It would have displaced 2,000 families, 800 businesses employing 10,000 people. So going back to the 20s, there's been plans to displace Chinatown. It's no secret that this is a working class immigrant neighborhood in the heart of the finance capital of the world. And I think on that point, it's interesting to note how that project was even created. Moses didn't have the power to do this himself. What he always did was find partners and make deals. In this case, it was the Rockefellers who created this thing called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, which lobbied for these urban renewal projects. And they're the same ones that you see in Chinatown, where the projects are now and some of the large parks. And they did this in exchange for Chase Manhattan Bank, which is owned by the Rockefeller family, getting a 1.5-acre Lower Manhattan skyscraper headquarters, which otherwise would not have been allowed by the zoning code. So going back to the early 20s, we have finance and the state enabling each other to displace massive numbers of people in Chinatown. Fast forward a little bit to 1969, which was the last time New York City had a master plan. This was under Governor Lindsay, and it was actually what formally killed the expressway. Interestingly, Chinatown is only talked about as a piece of the financial district and as a piece of the Lower East Side. The statistics count, and this is a quote, white, Negro, and other non-white, and Puerto Rican. Those are the only statistics counted. So obviously, they're not thinking of Chinatown as a place to plan around the way that they're thinking of other immigrant communities as a place. You see the early seeds of the Confucius Plaza plan in this plan, the Two Bridges Urban Renewal Project, which cut down 10 blocks of Chinatown and built up a $60 million development. And it hints at the deindustrialization and financialization of Lower Manhattan. There's a quote that I want to highlight from this plan. Again, this is 1969. Change, of course, is inevitable. The smaller lofts are being taken over by artists, and in time, housing and white-collar activities are going to supplant industry. The challenge in such areas is to guide the transition so that firms won't be forced out of business but relocated. And where are they going to be relocated to? Long Island City, Greenpoint, Red Hook, Flushing, Mott Haven, neighborhoods that are being gentrified now and deindustrialized now. So it's this constant displacement, first out of Lower Manhattan, then to these secondary neighborhoods, now with real estate capital there, out of those neighborhoods and elsewhere. Again, jump 10 years, 1979, Mayor Koch had a special Manhattan Bridge district that would have rezoned the area around East Broadway, special zoning district that would enable luxury development. There were 2 large projects that were going to go in there, and I can get into the details if anyone has questions, but the most important outcome of that were major community opposition. At the grassroots level and also in the courts, the project was stopped, and as a result of that, there is now, anytime the city or state has to do an environmental review project, they need to include the economic and social displacement that will occur. And that was actually as a result of working class Chinese opposition to that project. If we look at what's happening right now, the Bloomberg administration has done over 100 rezonings in neighborhoods, notably not Chinatown, except in small spots, in particular lots. What they did was they downzoned the most already gentrified areas in the Lower East Side and the East Village, upzoned major avenues, and then left the poorest parts of the Lower East Side and all of Chinatown unprotected by new zoning codes, which, if developers are looking for a place to park capital and do new development, now they can't go to the richest, whitest parts of the Lower East Side. They're much more likely to move into Chinatown because of this. So it was actually the absence of rezoning that was the racist component of that. It went through the community board and the city council. There was huge opposition, but it was approved. The Bloomberg administration is also looking at finally doing something with the Seward Park urban renewal area. I don't know how familiar folks are with this neighborhood in Chinatown. The biggest spot is a huge parking lot on Delancey Street on the south side. It's been vacant for 46 years. A number of working class homes were destroyed initially to build affordable housing that was never built. So there's been a clear demand in the neighborhood for 100% affordable housing on this spot. That's always been the demand. The plan right now is, I believe, 60% residential use of that spot. Only 50% would be affordable, and that's quote-unquote affordable. We all know that that's a scam. The other 40% is still parking, a relocated Essex Market, which currently exists just a block away, and a 200-room hotel. And as folks familiar with the neighborhood know, is already oversaturated with hotels, in part because the zoning code allows hotel construction in manufacturing zones, which Chinatown still is. And the last piece of the gentrification of Chinatown that I want to mention is a business improvement district that was recently approved. So business improvement districts are self-taxing areas. Basically, landlords vote on whether or not they want one of these. Residents and businesses don't have a vote. They almost always vote yes, and interestingly enough, there was a huge mobilization not only of tenants and small business owners, but of some landlords in Chinatown to oppose the business improvement district. And it was really sold on this racist rhetoric of Chinatown is dirty, Chinatown needs to be cleaned up, we need more tourism in Chinatown. And it eventually went through the city council and is being formed right now. So I think that that is going to be a major hurdle in fighting gentrification, the existence of the business improvement district. And I can also talk about that more later on. So to link this back to China, and I will let the other panelists do more of this work, but there is a proliferation of Chinese banks in Chinatown, and anyone who's walked around has experienced this and certainly seen the rise of it in recent decades. And like other big financial institutions, Chinese banks in Chinatown are not funding mom and pop shops and affordable housing. That's not where you make a return on investment. They're looking at large-scale development, and I mentioned Tari Hum. In her research, she's shown that 2/3 of lending goes to large-scale commercial development. Much of the rest goes to upscale housing development. And often they are the institutional support for upzoning in Chinatown, as well as in Sunset Park and Flushing. So if we think about why Chinese banks are suddenly so interested in investment in Chinatown, it really does link back to what's happening in China and the urban expansion that's happening there and the gentrification and displacement. there's a million statistics that can prove this, and most of them are so large that they just boggle the mind. But a couple that I picked out, from 1951, in 1951 China was 10% urban. In 2010 it was 47%. There's 3 times as many cities in 2012 as there were in just 1980. And we can trace this to a lot of sources, but I think the easiest one is to go to Deng Xiaoping's 424 growth points in China, creating special economic zones, which are a lot like free trade zones elsewhere, open economic areas in the Pearl River Delta, state tourist zones, and other kinds of state enabling of private capital to do the work of displacement and gentrification in China. In 1989, there was a City Planning Act, which it mirrored a lot of what was going on in neoliberal U.S. and Britain, where the planning function devolved from the state level to the local area to the city, and eventually to the private. So that process has been going on for over 30 years. Expressions of new urban expansion and gentrification in Chinatown today include the new South China Mall, which is the world's largest mall, new central business districts in already existing cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. So these are already cities with financial capitals that now have a second, third, fourth financial capitals within them. Skyrocketing housing prices in Beijing, Shanghai, and elsewhere are displacing people. These housing prices are far beyond what we saw in even the peak of the real estate bubble in the U.S. and New York. The city of Foshan grew 19% between 2000 and 2010, and to me 19% is actually hard to imagine what that even means, but it's way, way, way beyond the largest urban expansion anywhere else in the world during that period. I think it's the only double-digit expansion, and it's 19%. I can go on with this. I think another interesting point, though, that I do want to bring up is the Chinese government is actually contracting a British firm named Atkins and many others to build new cities. Atkins is building 48 cities the size of London in China, 48. So you can't do that without land grabbing, without displacement, and you wouldn't do it without gentrification, though you probably could. There's international land grabbing going on with Chinese corporations buying land in Argentina, Brazil, the Philippines, Sudan, and elsewhere, mostly using it for agricultural purposes and sending the products back as sort of a guaranteed way of feeding the Chinese population, while grabbing Chinese rural land and turning it into manufacturing for export. So there's this big recirculation where at one point the food was produced in the country and eaten in the country, the goods were produced in the country and eaten and used in the country. Now the goods are being produced in the country, exported out, the food is being produced somewhere else and imported in. And it's an entirely new model that is, again, state-enabled, privately run. And in terms of urban displacement, it's happening on such a massive level. I was going to talk about hutongs and sort of small-scale development being destroyed, but the truth is that's really the tip of the iceberg. And you can't create hundreds of new cities without displacing huge numbers of people. And so I think that point really speaks for itself, and I'll let the other panelists get into the details. Thanks.